I was 22 standard cycles old when I filed the report that ended the Classification Bureau, and I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened at Outpost Verath. I believed in the system, not the way a soldier believes in orders, because there is nothing else to believe in. Not the way a clerk believes in forms, because the forms are all he has ever been given. I believe the way a young analyst believes when the system has given him every answer he has ever needed, when every question he has ever asked has resolved into a tidy entry, when the archive has been his comfort and his map and his proof that the galaxy is knowable and that the Vael Consensus knows it. I still believe it in a sense. I believe the system was exactly what it claimed to be. I believe the archive held every entry it said it held. I believe the Classification Bureau had cataloged every vessel type, every emission class, every hull configuration, every weapon discharge signature of every spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy. I believe all of that. I believed it then, and I have not found a reason to stop. The problem was not what the archive contained. The problem was what arrived that was not in it. Let me start at the beginning, which is to say, let me start at the Outpost Verath duty briefing on the morning of the 43rd day of the Consensus's 7th enumerated fleet deployment, which was the morning after the ultimatum went to Earth. I had been at Verath for 11 days. It was my first posting outside the Bureau's central training cadre on Velath, and I was proud of it, in the way that very young analysts are proud of things, which is to say quietly and intensely, and in a way that I would later find embarrassing to recall. Outpost Verath was not a glamorous assignment. It sat at the edge of the Heth Corridor, a transit lane that connected the Consensus's outer provinces to the deep buffer zone between our space and Earth's. It was a listening post primarily, a classification node. Its job was to watch what moved through the Heth Corridor and name it. Everything that moved through the Heth Corridor had a name. 14 years of continuous operation. 11 analysts in rotation, 3 per watch. The Outpost's archive was a subset of the Central Bureau database, updated at every courier transit, which happened twice in a standard cycle. In 11 days I had classified 47 vessels, freighters mostly, a Consensus patrol cutter, 1 Thadari archive runner that had taken a wrong transit and registered as a Class 7 neutral, which I had noted with some professional satisfaction, because the Thadari emission signature is difficult to distinguish from a standard Consensus tender at long range, and I had caught the discrepancy in the ion trail. My senior analyst, a Vael named Comptroller Seveth, had noted my notation with a single nod, which was from Seveth the equivalent of a commendation. I tell you this because I want you to understand what kind of analyst I was. I was a good one. I was careful. I believed in precision. I believed that precision was what the archive was for, and that the archive was what the Consensus was for, and that what the Consensus was for was the ordering of a galaxy that would otherwise be chaos. The briefing on the 43rd day was routine. Seveth conducted it, as he conducted all briefings, standing at the center console with his hands folded behind him, his voice flat and methodical. He told us that the 7th enumerated fleet had taken position at coordinates Harith 7, 41 light minutes from Earth's primary transit egress. He told us that the ultimatum had been transmitted on the standard diplomatic frequency at exactly the 4th hour of the previous watch. He told us that the ultimatum gave Earth a period of 72 standard hours to acknowledge, capitulate, and arrange for the formal transfer of sovereignty documentation to the 7th Fleet's command vessel, at which point Earth would be reclassified from independent civilization, Class 5, to Protectorate, Class 3, and integrated into the Consensus archive as a managed system. He paused. He looked at the 3 of us on the morning watch. Then he said, in the same flat, methodical voice, that this was a formality. He said the word formality, and he meant it the way the Consensus uses that word, which is to say he meant it as a precise technical term. A formality in Consensus doctrine is a step whose outcome is already known, whose execution is required only to satisfy the archive. Earth's response was already decided. Earth had a fleet of 112 registered vessels, the largest of which was a cruiser-class ship, designated in the Bureau archive as a Type 14 Heavy Patrol, with a threat index of 3.7. The 7th Fleet comprised 4,008 vessels, ranging from destroyers to the command flagship, the Vael Consensus Instrument of Record, which had a threat index that the archive logged as exceeding the scale of measurement designed for Type 14 Heavy Patrols by a factor of several hundred. The outcome was known. The archive knew it. The math was simple. The formality would be observed. Earth would acknowledge. I nodded along with the other two analysts. We all believed Seveth. There was no reason not to believe him. Every number he had cited was in the archive. The contact came in during the second hour of my watch. I want to be precise about this because precision is what I was trained for. The contact appeared at 09:437 station time, emerging from the Heth corridor's primary transit egress at a range of 2.3 light minutes from outpost Verath. It resolved on the long-range array as a single solid return, which was unusual but not unprecedented. Single vessels transited the corridor regularly. I ran the standard classification sweep. The sweep took 4.2 seconds. It queried the archive for hull configuration match, emission class, ion trail signature, mass displacement reading, and drive type identifier. The sweep returned null on all 5 parameters. I looked at the result. I looked at it for what I later calculated was 11 seconds, which is a long time to stare at a console return without acting on it, when you are an analyst trained to act on returns. Then I ran the sweep again, because the correct response to a null return from the classification archive is to verify that the sweep was conducted correctly, which meant checking each parameter individually rather than as a batch query. Hull configuration match, null. Emission class, null. Ion trail signature, null. Mass displacement reading, 4,100,000 metric displacement units. This was not null. This was a number. It was in fact a very large number. A Type 14 Heavy Patrol, Earth's largest classified vessel, had a mass displacement reading of 280,000 metric displacement units. I stared at the number 4,100,000 for another several seconds. Drive type identifier, null. I turned to Seveth, who was at the secondary console reviewing the previous watch's logs. I told him I had a null return on classification, with a confirmed mass displacement of 4,100,000 units, emerging from the Heth corridor's primary egress. Seveth came to my console. He looked at the return. He looked at it for longer than 11 seconds. Then he ran the sweep himself, which I did not take as an insult to my competence. Seveth ran everything himself when it mattered. It was why he was a controller. The sweep returned null on 4 of the 5 parameters and 4,100,000 on the 5th. Seveth straightened. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Run the secondary cross-reference against the Bureau's deep archive." The deep archive was the full database, not the outpost subset. It transmitted on the emergency channel and took longer to query because it was routed through the courier relay at Velath, but the result was comprehensive. Every vessel type ever catalogued by the consensus, going back 1,400 standard cycles of continuous record-keeping. Every hull, every drive signature, every emission class that any spacefaring civilization in the known galaxy had ever produced. I ran the deep archive cross-reference. It took 11 minutes to return, because the relay added latency. When it returned null on 4 of 5 parameters and 4,100, 0 on the 5th. Seveth said nothing. He stood at my console and looked at the return for a long time. Outside the viewport, at a range that was now 2.1 light minutes, because the contact had moved slightly closer while we had been sweeping, the sensor return sat solid and unchanged on the long-range array. It was not doing anything. It was simply there, registering 4,100, 0 metric displacement units and no classification. The other 2 analysts on my watch had stopped their work and were watching us. Seveth turned to them and told them to return to their stations. Then he turned to me and told me to open a priority channel to the Bureau's regional command node at Velath and report a classification failure, category unknown, with the mass displacement figure attached. I asked him what category unknown meant. I had never heard of it. He told me it was a legacy designation. It existed in the system for exactly one purpose, which was to be used when an analyst encountered something the archive did not contain. He told me it had not been invoked in the outpost's 14-year operational history. He told me, in the same flat voice he used for everything, that it had not been invoked in the entire consensus communication network in the last 211 standard cycles. I opened the priority channel. I filed the report. Category unknown Heth corridor primary egress. No 9437 station time. Null classification 4100. 00 metric displacement units. The signal went to Velath. Then I turned back to the sensor return and watched it sit there in the dark. 4,100, 0 units of something that had no name. The response from Velath came in at the start of the 3rd hour. By then, the contact had moved to 1.9 light minutes and had not altered its bearing or its readings in any measurable way. It had not emitted. It had not maneuvered. It had not hailed on any frequency we monitored. It had done nothing at all except exist at 4100 metric displacement units on our long-range array with no designation in any archive the consensus possessed. The response from the regional command node was signed by Classification Director Moth, who was the senior bureau officer for our sector and who I had met exactly once at my posting ceremony, where he had shaken my hand and told me the archive was a living thing that required constant care. The response said, "Acknowledged. Category unknown is confirmed open. All sweep data transmitted for central review. Maintain observation and do not attempt communication with the contact until classification is resolved. Do not attempt communication until classification is resolved." I read that 3 times. Then I read the next line, which was the instruction that told me why. Consensus protocol required that all communication with an unclassified contact be conducted through the Bureau's diplomatic transmission system, which required that the contact first be assigned a provisional classification and a provisional threat index before any transmission could be authorized. The diplomatic transmission system could not route a message to a contact that had no classification. The form required a field for vessel class. The form required a field for civilization index. The form required a field for threat tier. Without those fields populated, the form could not be submitted. Without the form submitted, the transmission could not be authorized. Without the authorization, no transmission could go out. The archive could not name the contact, and the consensus could not speak to what it could not name. I looked at Seveth and told him what the protocol meant. He told me he was aware of what the protocol meant. He said it in his flat, methodical voice, but I had learned, over 11 days of watching Seveth work, that the flatness of his voice was not always the same flatness. There were gradations. The voice he used when he told me the protocol requirement was a different voice than the one he used to brief us on the 7th Fleet's positioning. It was flatter, if that is possible. It was flat in the way something is flat when it has pressed itself down as far as it can go. The hours passed. By the 5th hour, the contact had moved to 1.7 light minutes and held. The regional command node had escalated to the Bureau's Central Directorate on Vael. The Central Directorate had escalated to the Consensus High Administration. The High Administration had issued a clarification inquiry to the Central Bureau Archive, asking whether the contact might be a reconfigured variant of any classified hull type, which would allow a provisional classification to be opened. The Bureau's archive analyst ran the comparison. The archive said no. It said no in the precise technical language of archive negation, which meant that the hull configuration was not a variant, not a subtype, not a derivative, not a reconfiguration, not a modification, not an evolution of any previously catalogued vessel. It was not a Type 14 heavy patrol with additional plating. It was not any number of human vessel designations layered together. It was not anything the archive had. The archive did not have a parent category to put it in. There was no slot. There was no approximation. There was no close enough. The mass displacement figure of 4,100,000 metric displacement units meant that the contact was, if it were any conventional type of warship, approximately 14 times the displacement of Earth's largest previously classified vessel. But that comparison was meaningless, because the archive had no hull class for an object of that displacement in Earth's fleet inventory. Earth's fleet inventory, as the archive had it, did not contain objects of that displacement. The archive was, in the Bureau's understanding, complete. Earth had been a watched civilization for 47 stand cycles. Every vessel they had ever launched had been catalogued. There were no gaps, and yet the 4,100,000 unit return sat on our array and returned null. I ran 16 individual subparameter sweeps between the 5th and 7th hours, each targeting a different subset of the classification criteria, looking for any partial match that might give the Bureau's deep archive analysts something to begin a provisional designation from. Hull geometry subprofile, null. Structural resonance signature, null. Thermal emission profile at rest, null. Gravity displacement wave from mass presence. This returned a figure, and the figure agreed with 4,100,000 units. And the archive confirmed it was real and physical, and then confirmed it had no classification context for a real and physical object of that gravity displacement in an Earth hull configuration. I filed each subparameter result as a supplemental report and transmitted it to Vael. The deep archive analyst responded, each time with a polite acknowledgement and a null. By the 6th hour, I had run out of subparameter sweeps. I had run them all. Every parameter the Bureau's classification system recognized, I had queried. The contact had returned a figure on exactly 3 of them: mass displacement, gravity displacement wave, and optical cross-section, which I had calculated from the long-range array's passive light return as consistent with an object approximately 28 to 33 kilometers in length. Everything else was null. The contact existed in physical space. The contact was real. The contact had mass, had length, displaced gravity, and returned photons, and the archive had nothing to call it. What I kept returning to in the quiet between reports was a simple question that the archive was not equipped to answer. How long had this taken to build? The consensus had been watching Earth for 47 standard cycles. Every launch, every test, every orbital construction platform, cataloged. The archive's Earth inventory was comprehensive. It said so in its own metadata. Complete coverage from the point of first diplomatic contact onward. And yet the archive had never seen 4,100,000 units of null. Which meant either the archive had failed to observe it, or Earth had concealed it, or it had been built somewhere the archive did not watch. None of those possibilities were comfortable. A failure of archive coverage meant the archive was not complete, which it claimed to be. Active concealment meant Earth had understood the archive well enough to hide from it deliberately, which implied a level of consensus doctrine study that the archive had no record of. Construction outside observed space meant Earth had facilities the archive had not located, which also contradicted the archive's completeness claim. I filed a notation about these 3 possibilities in my 6th-hour supplemental report. The notation occupied 4 lines. It was the most important thing in the report, and it was buried in the supplementals, which is where important things often end up when the person writing them does not yet have the standing to put them in the main body. By the 7th hour, the 7th Fleet's command vessel had been informed of the classification failure. The command tier of the 7th Fleet comprised Admiral Primus Kethan Orvath, who had 41 years of service in the consensus military, who had participated in the integration of 3 independent civilizations into the consensus as protectorates, and who had, in those 41 years, never once received a fire order that the archive had not already pre-authorized. Consensus military doctrine was an extension of the archive. A vessel was identified. The archive assigned its threat index. The threat index determined the engagement protocol. The engagement protocol told the fleet what to do. The fleet did it. The doctrine did not have a step that said, the archive does not know what this is. Admiral Primus Orvath requested an emergency classification ruling from the Bureau. The Bureau confirmed that no classification could be issued until the archive could be updated with a new entry for the contact's hull type, which required analysis, cross-referencing, and formal designation, which was a process that took at minimum 6 standard days under emergency procedures. The 7th Fleet had been authorized to begin integration operations against Earth within 72 hours of the ultimatum's transmission. It was now 7 hours past the ultimatum. The contact had not fired. It had not maneuvered aggressively. It had not communicated. It had simply moved from the transit egress to a position 1.7 light minutes from outpost Verath and sat there, 4100, so units of nothing the archive recognized, and waited. Waiting, I was beginning to understand, was itself a kind of weapon. But the archive had no category for that either. I filed my 7th watch report at the start of the 8th hour. I had been on duty for 8 hours because 7th had not dismissed the morning watch. Because dismissing the morning watch meant leaving the classification console with an ongoing category unknown contact on the array. And 7th was not the kind of controller who walked away from an open file. I did not ask to be dismissed. I was not sure I could have left. The 2 other analysts on my watch had stopped looking at the contact's return after the 3rd hour. They looked at their secondary consoles and did their subsidiary work in silence. I understood why. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from looking at something that should not exist and watching it exist anyway, for hours, without resolution. At some point, the mind finds other things to look at. It is not cowardice. It is what the mind does when the data it is receiving has no frame to go into. My mind did not find other things to look at. I watched the return. I logged every minute of its position. I noted that it had not varied its bearing by more than 0.0003 degrees in 8 hours. I noted that its emission signature remained null across the full spectrum. I noted that it had not, in 8 hours, performed any of the 19 behaviors that the archive listed as standard pre-engagement indicators for any vessel of any classification. No weapons port cycling, no shield layer activation, no targeting emission, no communication burst, no maneuvering thrust. It was just there. And the being there, I was beginning to understand, was the point. There is something particular about watching a sensor return that does not change. Most returns change. A freighter adjusts its bearing for corridor traffic. A patrol cutter cycles its active pings. Even a stationary station shows thermal variation as internal systems cycle. The contact at 1.7 light minutes showed none of that. Its position figure updated on my log at 5-second intervals and was each time within 200 meters of its previous position. Its emission signature updated on my subarray at 1-second intervals and was each time null. After 8 hours of watching that, I began to understand that the stillness was not passive. A vessel that large, holding that precisely, with that emission profile, was performing a very active nothing. It was demonstrating capability by withholding it. Every minute that it sat there motionless was a minute in which the consensus could observe that it could be motionless for that long. And then another minute could be added to that, and another, and the accumulation of those minutes was itself the message. This is how long we can wait. Longer than you need us to. The 7th Fleet had 72 hours from the ultimatum before its integration order became overdue. 32 of those hours were already gone when I came on watch. The contact had been sitting at 1.7 light minutes for several of those hours, returning null, breathing nothing, moving nothing, showing the fleet its stillness. 65 hours remained on the integration order clock when the contact finally moved. At the start of the 9th hour and 41 minutes of my watch, the contact moved. It had been 1.7 light minutes from outpost Verath for most of my shift. It had held that position with a precision that I, even now, find difficult to describe in terms that fully convey what I mean. The outpost's position logging system updated at 5-second intervals. Over the 31,200 seconds of the contact's stationary period, the position log showed a variation in bearing of 0.0003 degrees and a variation in range of less than 200 meters. At 4,100,000 metric displacement units, held to within 200 meters over 9 hours and 41 minutes. When it moved, I felt it before the console registered it. That is not a thing I can explain scientifically. I was watching the return. Something about the quality of the return changed, in a way that was below the threshold of the sensors, in a way that my eyes should not have been able to detect. And then the position log updated. And the range figure changed, and the contact was no longer stationary. It had turned. It was now bearing toward coordinates Harith 7, toward the 7th Fleet. I opened the priority channel to Velath and reported the movement. Then I turned to Seveth and told him the contact was moving toward the fleet. He told me he had seen it. He was looking at the array with his hands at his sides, not behind his back as he usually held them. It was the first time I had seen him stand that way. The contact's velocity was logged at 0.31 of light speed. This figure went into the archive query immediately, because velocity is one of the parameters used in classification. The archive returned null. The velocity figure did not correspond to any drive type in the archive, not because 0.31 of light speed was impossible. Several classified vessel types achieved comparable velocities, but because no known drive type that could move a 4,100,000 unit displacement vessel achieved that velocity with the emission signature of 0 that our sensors were recording. The physics of known drive types did not permit it. The archive said so, because the archive had the physics of every known drive type and their emission outputs at every velocity increment. None of them said 0.31 of light speed, 4,100,000 units, 0 emission. The contact was not in the archive. It was also moving toward 1,008 ships of the 7th Fleet at 0.31 of light speed with 0 emission, which meant that the fleet's passive sensor arrays would detect it at approximately the same time that we at Outpost Verath had detected it, which meant the fleet's classification systems would be running the same null sweep that ours had run, and receiving the same null result, and the fleet's engagement authorization protocol would be reading the Bureau's active suspension notice. And the flag officers in the command tier would be looking at each other across their bridge consoles and understanding, as I was understanding, that the doctrine had no step for this. I filed my 8th watch report. I noted the contact's new bearing, its velocity, its continued null classification, its estimated time of arrival at coordinates Harith 7 at current velocity, which I calculated as 4 hours and 12 minutes. I transmitted the report to Vael. Then I sat down, because my legs had decided that standing was no longer something they needed to be doing, and I watched the return move across the array. The next 3 hours and 40 minutes were the strangest of my professional life, and I say that as someone who has now spent 22 years in various archive and intelligence roles where strange things occasionally appear in. The data. The contact moved toward Harith 7 at 0.31 of light speed. The 7th Fleet's command tier transmitted a total of 14 requests to the Bureau's Central Directorate, asking for Emergency Provisional Classification Authority, which is the mechanism by which a fleet commander can request a temporary designation sufficient to authorize engagement in a time-critical situation. The Bureau's Central Directorate transmitted 14 denials. Not because the Bureau was indifferent to the fleet's position, because the provisional classification mechanism also required a base hull type to provisionally assign. You could not issue a provisional threat index to a vessel that had no hull type, any more than you could issue a provisional address to a building that did not exist. The form did not have a field for null. The form was not designed to be submitted with null in the hull type field. The system would not accept it. The fleet requested that the suspension notice be lifted by administrative authority. The High Administration transmitted a determination that suspension notices could not be lifted without Bureau confirmation of classification. Resolution. Because the purpose of the suspension rule was to prevent precisely the action the fleet was requesting, engagement with an unclassified contact, and lifting the rule to permit engagement would defeat the rule. The fleet requested that the High Administration issue a special military order overriding the suspension rule. The High Administration transmitted a determination that special military orders had to be filed through the Bureau's authorization system, which also required a valid classification for the target of the order. I sat at my console and I watched the contact move across the array, and I thought, in the way that young analysts sometimes think when the implications of a thing they have been trained in finally resolve into something concrete. Someone on Earth had understood all of this before they built the ship. Not maybe, not possibly, definitively. Because the alternative was that Earth had built a 4100 zero-unit vessel with a zero-emission drive and a hull configuration unlike anything in the Consensus archive entirely by accident, and had sent it, entirely by accident, on a bearing toward the 7th Fleet, on the day after the ultimatum, at exactly the velocity that would bring it to the fleet in 4 hours and 12 minutes, all without meaning any of it. The alternative required more coincidence than the archive could hold. Someone had studied the archive, or, more precisely, someone had studied the consensus. They had studied the doctrine. They had found the rule about classification and engagement authorization. They had found the rule about provisional classification and the hull type requirement. They had found the suspension mechanism. They had built a ship that would return null. Not a ship that was too fast to stop. Not a ship that was too well armed to fight. Not a ship that could destroy the 7th Fleet in the conventional sense. A ship that the archive could not contain. A ship that the doctrine could not reach. A ship that sat outside the system entirely, and therefore made the system do nothing. Not because the system failed, but because the system worked exactly as designed. And as designed, it could not engage what it could not name. That was the category error. It was not the ship speed. It was not its size. It was the null return. Seveth was at the main console when I stood up. I told him what I had concluded. He told me he had reached the same conclusion approximately 6 hours earlier. He told me he had included it in his escalation report to the regional command node. He told me in his flat voice that the regional command node had included it in their report to the Central Directorate, and the Central Directorate had included it in their report to the High Administration. And the High Administration had noted it. I asked what the High Administration had decided in response. Seveth said, "They are still deciding." I asked what the fleet was doing. He said, "Holding." The contact arrived at coordinates Harith 7 at exactly the time I had calculated. 4 hours and 12 minutes from when it had begun moving. It dropped from 0.31 of light speed to approximately 0 over a period of 48 seconds, which the archive noted was also a velocity change profile that did not correspond to any deceleration curve it held for any drive type of any class. It came to rest at a distance of 3,200 kilometers from the command vessel, which was the Vael Consensus instrument of record. I had the fleet's sensor feed on my secondary console by that point. The Verath outpost had been patched into the fleet's observation network when the contact began moving. What I was looking at on a low-resolution relay was what the instrument of record's own sensors were looking at in high resolution. The contact was a ship. That is to say, it was recognizably a ship in the architectural sense, in the way that any constructed thing intended to move through space is recognizably a ship if you look at it. It had a hull. The hull was roughly linear, significantly longer than it was wide, with a tapered forward section and a broader aft assembly. The hull was dark. The hull was extremely dark, not in the sensor return sense, which was null, but in the visual band light return sense, which the fleet's optical array was now giving us. It absorbed light, not in a stealth coding way that the archive would have flagged. In a material way, as if the hull plating was made of something that simply did not return photons at any significant rate. What little light did return from its surface showed plating that was deeply weathered in a way I had not expected from a vessel that the archive had never logged. Scratched in long lateral striations, the panels at the aft section slightly mismatched in shade and surface treatment, as if sections of it had been repaired or replaced over a period of years, and the replacements had not yet matched the oxidation of the original hull. It had been used. Whatever it was, it had been used before this. I could not tell from the relay its full age. I could not tell from the sensor null what powered it. I could not tell what its hull material was made of or why it returned null on the emission spectrum. What I could tell was its length from the optical array. The instrument of record had a length that the archive logged at 4.2 kilometers. The instrument of record was in the frame of the optical array image for scale reference. The contact was 31 kilometers long. I read that figure and I was quiet for a moment, and then I read it again. 31 kilometers, one hull, no fleet, no escorts. One ship, 31 kilometers from bow to aft, sitting at 3,200 kilometers from the Vael Consensus instrument of record, returning null on every sensor parameter except its mass displacement and its optical presence, which was what the instrument of record's crew was looking at through their viewports. The contact sat there. The fleet sat around it. 4,008 vessels. The 7th Fleet had 4,008 vessels. The contact had one hull, 31 kilometers of null against the dark, and it held its position among 4,008 ships of the consensus military, as if the 4,008 ships were an incidental detail, which in every meaningful tactical sense they were, because none of them could receive a fire authorization, and therefore none of them could shoot. The fleet could see it. Every optical array on every vessel in the 7th Fleet could see it. 31 kilometers of hull that the archive said did not exist, sitting 200 kilometers off the bow of the command vessel. And the fleet watched it, and the archive processed its null query for the 14th time in the same hour, and the High Administration received the fleet's 14th emergency provisional classification request and issued its 14th denial, and the suspension notice remained open, and the contact did not move, and 4,008 ships of the consensus military held position and did nothing. I had access to the fleet's internal communication logs through the observation network patch, which was unusual. Normally, the Classification Bureau had read access to fleet sensor data only, not to signals traffic. But the Bureau's Central Directorate had granted the access that morning, when the contact began moving, on the grounds that the classification review required full situational data. I did not read the personal channels. I read the command tier's operational logs, which I was authorized to read, and the operational logs showed me what the first hour of the standoff looked like. From inside the instrument of record, the command tier had run their own classification sweep, naturally. They had run it 16 times in the first 40 minutes, each time using a slightly different parameter weighting, as if a different weighting might produce a different result. It did not. Their sweep returned null, the same way our sweep returned null, because the archive that their sweep queried was the same archive that our sweep had queried, and the archive had not changed since 09-1437 station time, when I first asked it what 4,100,000 units of something was, and it told me, nothing I know. After the 16th sweep, the command tier had convened a senior staff assessment. The assessment lasted 22 minutes and produced a memorandum, which I read, which said in formal consensus military language that the contact was confirmed unclassifiable under current archive entries, that engagement authorization could not be issued under the suspension protocol, and that the command tier would pursue all available administrative remedies to obtain emergency provisional classification. The memorandum was signed by Admiral Primus Orvath and 6 senior staff officers. It was in its precise and formal language, a document acknowledging that the 4008 ships of the 7th Fleet could not act, and that this was not a failure of nerve or capability, but a consequence of the doctrine that the fleet had been built to operate within. I read that memorandum, and I thought about the analyst at whatever Earth institution had spent however many years studying the consensus, reading the doctrine, finding the exact point where the machine interlocked with itself. I thought about that analyst's version of my console and what it must have felt like to find the gap and understand it clearly enough to brief an engineering team to build around it. I thought about the 31-kilometer hull, sitting 3,200 kilometers off the bow of the instrument of record, and the 41 years of Admiral Primus Orvath's service, and I thought, this is the worst thing the archive has ever produced, and it produced it by being correct. For the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th hours of the standoff, the contact maintained its position. The fleet maintained its formation. The archive maintained its null. The High Administration maintained its denials. The suspension notice remained open. The clock on the integration order continued to decrement. None of it changed. In the 4th hour, the fleet's medical division filed an unusual report, which I also had access to through the observation network. The report noted elevated stress indicators in 17 senior personnel across the command tier, consistent with sustained psychological load under high-stakes inaction. The fleet's senior medical officer noted, in language that was careful and clinical, that the condition of being able to observe a target and being procedurally unable to engage it, for an extended duration, produced specific cognitive strain in personnel, whose training was oriented entirely around engagement. They were trained to do things. They were sitting still. The two conditions were in conflict, and the conflict had a physiological signature. I filed a notation in my own watch report about that medical report. I noted that the same condition applied to classification analysts, and that the appropriate response was the same. Continue to do the job correctly, regardless of what the job's correct output was. I do not know if anyone read that notation. I suspect not. Junior subalterns' watch notations are not typically circulated widely. I want to tell you something about what that looked like on my console, and I want to be precise. It looked like nothing had happened. The sensor returns for the fleet and the contact were static, no weapon discharge, no movement, no signals, static. If you had not known what you were looking at, you might have thought you were watching a standstill. And you would have been right. It was a standstill. But the standstill was the weapon. It had been held for 3 hours now. 3 hours of 31 kilometers of null sitting at 200 kilometers from the consensus command vessel. And in those 3 hours, the 7th Fleet had moved from being a military deployment, ready to execute an integration order against an independent civilization rated Class 5, to being 4,008 ships waiting for a bureaucratic process to complete, none of which would complete, because the bureaucratic process required a hull classification that the archive did not have and could not produce. The Bureau could not resolve the classification in 6 days. The Bureau had said so. The Bureau had transmitted in its formal suspension notice its best estimate for the time required under emergency procedures. 6 days. The contact could hold its position for 6 days. It had demonstrated, over the preceding 13 hours, that holding a position was something it did exceptionally well. At the start of the 6th hour, after the contact's arrival at coordinates Harith 7, I received a transmission marked for my personal attention from the Bureau's Central Directorate. It was not a procedural document. It was a direct communication, addressed to me by name, from Classification Director Moth. The director asked me, as the outpost analyst who had filed the first category unknown report, for my personal assessment of the contact's nature and intent. He said this was an unusual request and that he was aware it was outside normal procedure, but that normal procedure had not produced an assessment that the High Administration found useful, and the High Administration had asked him to seek additional perspectives. I wrote the assessment. It took me 40 minutes to write it. I want to tell you what it said, because this is the part of the account that matters most. I told the director that the contact's nature was a vessel of Earth origin, almost certainly purpose-built for this deployment, constructed with the primary design objective of returning null on every parameter of the consensus classification system. I told him that the intent was not to destroy the 7th Fleet. I told him the intent was to demonstrate that the fleet could be made inoperative, without a shot being fired, by a single vessel, by the simple mechanism of being unclassifiable. I told him that the message was not, Earth has a ship that can defeat your fleet. The message was, Earth has a ship your system cannot reach. And then I wrote the part that I thought, at the time, might end my career, but that I felt was the only honest thing I could put in the document. I told him that the Vael Consensus's doctrine was not broken. The doctrine had worked exactly as designed. The suspension rule, the classification requirement, the engagement authorization system, all of it had functioned correctly. The problem was not that the system had failed. The problem was that the system's correctness was, in this case, its vulnerability. A system that required prior classification to authorize engagement could be paralyzed by an entity that resisted classification. And if Earth knew this, and the existence of the contact proved that Earth knew this, then the question the High Administration needed to answer was not how to classify the contact. That question would eventually be resolved. The contact would be classified eventually. An entry would be created. A designation would be assigned. The question was whether Earth had only one of them. I sent the assessment. Director Moth transmitted his acknowledgement 14 minutes later. It said 3 words, well filed, subaltern. 3 hours after I sent the assessment, the contact moved again. This time it did not move toward the fleet's interior. It moved at a gentle, measured bearing away from the 7th Fleet's formation and back toward the Heth Corridor transit egress, 0.31 of light speed. 0 emission, 4100. Units of null retreating at exactly the speed at which it had arrived. In 4 hours and 12 minutes, it would reach the transit egress. The 7th Fleet did not pursue. The suspension's notice remained open. The classification remained null. The doctrine still could not authorize engagement. I watched the contact's position figure change on my array, the range increasing from the fleet's coordinates, and I filed a position update report every 15 minutes because that was my job. 7th had finally rotated the watch. I was the only original morning watch analyst still at my station. I did not want to leave. I know how that sounds. I know it was not efficient or procedurally correct, but the contact was my file, and I wanted to be the one at the console when it reached the transit egress. It reached the transit egress at 23:31:9 station time, 14 hours and 16 minutes after it had first appeared on my long-range array. Its return was solid and stable until the moment it entered the transit corridor, and then, as transit entries always do, it dispersed into the background noise of the quarter's particle wake, and my array showed empty space where 4100, 0 metric displacement units of null had been. I logged the transit at 23:31:9. I filed the contact closed report. I marked the category unknown designation as pending resolution in the Bureau's system, which meant it would remain open in the archive until the classification was formally issued, which would take 6 standard days under emergency procedures. The pending resolution flag stayed in the archive for the next 4 years, because the Bureau's analysts could not agree on a hull designation that the archive's categorization standards would accept. Internally, the contact was referred to by the case number it had been assigned when I opened the category unknown flag. UNK Veratheo 01. Externally, in the documents that eventually became part of the historical record, it was referred to as the hull without a name, which was not a Bureau designation, but was what the 7th Fleet's signals officers had started calling it in informal communications, and which spread from there. What happened in the political and administrative sphere in the days following is documented elsewhere, and I will only summarize it here, because this account is a first-hand document of what I saw from Outpost Verath, not a history of the Consensus High Administration's decisions. The 7th Fleet was recalled from coordinates Harith 7 within 9 days of the contact's transit out of the Heth Corridor. The formal recall order cited a pending review of the classification doctrine and the suspension mechanism, and the need to refine the engagement authorization protocol to address novel contact types. The integration order against Earth was suspended pending the same review. Admiral Primus Keithan Orvath, who had commanded the 7th Fleet, filed for retirement 3 days after the recall order was transmitted. 2 other senior flag officers filed within the week. The retirement filings cited personal reasons, as retirement filings do. The personal reasons were not elaborated upon in the public record. I do not think they needed to be. A flag officer who had spent 40 years in a military doctrine built on the archive, and who had sat for 9 hours and 41 minutes and then 4 additional hours in a standoff, with a 31-kilometer null return, had already done his own internal elaboration, I suspect, and did not need to put it in a filing. The Classification Bureau review was completed 8 months later. The review produced a document that ran to several thousand pages and that I read in its entirety. The review's central conclusion was that the engagement authorization system was sound, and that the suspension mechanism was sound, and that the doctrine was sound. The review also concluded that the doctrine had an identified vulnerability in the specific case of purpose-built unclassifiable vessels, and recommended a new emergency classification tier that would allow provisional engagement authorization in cases where mass displacement exceeded a defined threshold regardless of classification status. The threshold was set at 2,000 metric displacement units. The hull without a name had a mass displacement of 4,100,000. It exceeded the proposed threshold by a factor of 2. I noted this in the public comment period for the review's recommendations, along with a technical observation that a purpose-built unclassifiable vessel could presumably be constructed at any displacement, including below the proposed threshold, if Earth chose to build smaller ones, or above it, if they chose to build larger. The observation was noted in the review's final published addendum, and then not acted upon in any way that I observed, which is the fate of most technical observations made by junior analysts in public comment periods. The Classification Bureau was dissolved 11 months after the review was published. Its functions were absorbed into the High Administration's Strategic Assessment Directorate, which operated on a different doctrinal basis. The archive itself was preserved and remains in operation. The category unknown flag for UNK Vareth 001 was never resolved. The entry sits in the archive today. It sat when I was a 22-cycle-old analyst, watching 4,100,000 units of null on my long-range array. Pending resolution, hull type unknown, threat index unassigned, all parameters null except the mass displacement. I transferred off Outpost Verath 8 months after the contact's transit. The posting that followed was at the Bureau's Central Directorate on Vael, which was, I understood, a consequence of the report I had filed and the assessment director Moth had requested. Not a reward, exactly, not a punishment. The Bureau wanted the analyst who had opened UNK Varus 01 closer to the review process, which made practical sense. I was at the directorate when the review's final document was produced. I read it the day it was published. I have described above what the review concluded. What I have not described is the conversation I had with Director Moth on the day the Bureau dissolution order was transmitted, which was 11 months after the review. He called me to his office on the 43rd floor of the Central Directorate building on Vael, which had a view of the city that I had admired from a distance but never seen from that height. He was packing his personal effects into a container. The shelves behind his desk were mostly empty. He offered me a seat. He told me that the dissolution order was not a consequence of UNK Vareth 001. He said this carefully, in the tone of someone who wants a precise thing recorded, and I understood that he was not saying it to comfort me. He was saying it because it was precisely true in the administrative sense, which is a different thing from being true in every other sense. I told him I understood the distinction. He told me that the archive would continue. The archive would always continue. The archive was not at fault. The archive had done what it was designed to do, which was to hold everything it had been given and to return null for everything it had not. The null was an honest answer. The null was the correct answer. The archive had been correct. He said this and he looked for a moment out of the window at the city he had spent 30 years filing reports about, and then he turned back to his packing. I asked him if he thought Earth had more of them. He stopped packing. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The question is not whether Earth has more of them. The question is whether the new Strategic Assessment Directorate has a doctrine that produces a different result when it encounters them. And the answer to that question is available from the public documentation if you want to read it." I had read it. The Strategic Assessment Directorate's Engagement Authorization Protocol addressed the specific vulnerability that UNK Vareth 001 had demonstrated. It had a mechanism for provisional designation based on mass displacement thresholds, as the review had recommended. It was a better protocol than the one it replaced, in the narrow sense that it addressed the specific gap that had been identified. I did not tell Director Moth what I had concluded about the threshold. I had put it in the public comment period. It was in the record. He would have read it. We sat in his office for a few more minutes. He finished packing his personal effects. I thanked him for the assessment request he had sent to Outpost Verath, because the assessment request was the document that had made my career, and I was aware of that. He told me the assessment had been the most useful document produced during the entire review process, which was a generous thing to say, and which I believed was also precisely true. I have been asked, over the years, what I think the hull without a name was saying when it held position among 4,008 ships of the 7th Fleet for 6 hours, and then turned and left. The honest answer is that I think it was saying what it needed to say and no more. It had been at coordinates Harith 7 for 6 hours. 6 hours was enough to establish, in the clearest possible terms, that the fleet could not act. The contact could have held for 6 days. It held for 6 hours. The shorter duration, I think, was a courtesy of sorts, or something that functions like a courtesy. A way of not grinding the demonstration into something that could not be walked back. Long enough for the point to register. Short enough to leave room for what came after. What came after was the suspension of the integration order and the recall of the fleet, and 3 admirals filing for retirement and the dissolution of the Classification Bureau. What came after was the High Administration's review and the new emergency classification tier and the technical observation that nobody acted on. What came after was the UNK Varathozo 1 entry, still open in the archive. A null sitting in the system like a stone in still water, permanent and unresolved. I wrote my report, I filed it, Seveth signed it. It went to Velath, and from Velath to the Central Directorate, and from the Central Directorate to the High Administration, and the archive and the historical record. In the historical record it is a precise and thorough document. It covers every sensor reading, every sweep parameter, every position log, every velocity figure, every escalation request and administrative denial. It covers the contact's arrival and its departure and everything in between. It is, I believe, as complete a first-hand account as exists. The one thing it does not contain is a classification for what I watched. Arrive through the Heth corridor on the morning of the 43rd day, sit among 4,008 ships of the Vael Consensus 7th Fleet for 9 hours and 41 minutes, and then leave. That field is still blank. It will always be blank. The hull without a name does not have an archive entry, because the hull without a name was the answer to the archive. It was built to be the thing the archive could not hold, and the archive, which is meticulous and thorough, and has been carefully maintained for 1,400 standard cycles, is honest enough to admit it. The null is still there. The pending resolution flag is still there. The mass displacement figure of 4,100, 00 metric displacement units is still there. Everything else is blank. That was the message. Not a shot fired. Not a ship destroyed. Not an armada erased. Just a null return, sustained for 9 hours and 41 minutes among 4,008 ships of the 7th Fleet, and then the long bearing home. I was 22 standard cycles old when I watched it arrive. I am 44 now, and I still check the archive entry sometimes, not looking for a resolution. There will not be one. I check it to confirm that the null is still there, which it always is, because the hull has no name and the archive does not lie. A ship that cannot be named cannot be stopped. Earth knew that before they built it. We learned it after.